So hopefully you found that video interesting and that you saw what we're talking about with rough and tumble play. We're not talking about the kind of play where there's a high probability of somebody getting injured. It does incorporate a component of pretend. Daddy becomes a monster, right? And the kids all go, ee, and they all squeal. Or let's pretend like these little tiny children are big enough to possibly pin dad down, or things like that. So it does include a component of pretend play. It doesn't include the kind of pretend play where you officially say, okay, I'm going to pretend to be a bear and you're going to pretend to be scared, right? Like you don't lay it out like that. It just initiates. And that is one of the things that makes it kind of different from the other kind of pretend play that we see developing. So the emotional issue was brought up a lot in that video. And so I think it's important to transition out of play into emotion because sometimes play allows children to work out their emotions. Sometimes it sort of amps up their emotions so that they start to, get scared in the middle of play, or they start to get too excited while they're playing. Emotions are really developing during this period of time. I thought it would be useful to pull this graphic from our textbook to kind of explain it a little bit. What they're looking at is on the left panel are babies who were tested at 4 months of age and displayed inhibited or fearful behaviors. On the right panel, we're seeing babies who at 4 months displayed positive or exuberant behaviors. For the ones who were inhibited and fearful at 4 months, still a large proportion of them, about 42% of them, were displaying inhibited and fearful responses when they were retested at 9 months, 14 months, 24 months, and then again at 48 months. So 48 months is a 4-year-old, right? So it looks like those who tested as fearful at 4 months persisted with that about 42% of the time. Almost equal numbers have transitioned out of inhibited fearful behavior from at 4 months to more variable behavior by these older follow-up dates. So the important, I think, takeaway from that is that you're just as likely to still be fearful at the older ages as you are to be sometimes fearful, sometimes not. Like it's not a guarantee that you're always going to be fearful if you were fearful at 4 months. Only about 12% were displaying positive behavior at all measurements at the 9, 14, 24, and 48 months measurements. And so a very small subset of babies who were fearful at 4 months were displaying purely positive behaviors by the time they were older. Now, if we look over on the right-hand panel, we see that if they were positive at 4 months, they were really likely to still be positive at all the follow-up measurements. 80% of the time, they were still positive. A small percentage, 15%, were displaying variable behaviors, and 5% were displaying fearful behaviors every time they were retested. I think the most important takeaway from this is that if we have a predisposition to behave a certain way, and I think anything that a 4-month-old is displaying is probably largely due to disposition and less likely to be due to environmental factors, because you haven't had much time to interact with the environment by the time you're 4 months old. So if you're displaying something at 4 months of age, it's probably temperamental or dispositional. It looks like if what you're displaying at 4 months is positive, that it's easier to stay in that positive train. Whereas the inhibited babies at 4 months, the environment seems to have helped them to move out of that. The environment does its best to help a child to move out of that perspective. It doesn't work perfectly. We see a lot of variable infants. It may not work at all. We see some infants that are still fearful, and maybe those are the infants whose environments were conducive to maintaining that fearful approach. But what I really want you to focus in on is that positive number. 12% of initially fearful children are displaying positive reactions, whereas if you look at the fearful reactions, on the right-hand side, only 5% of positive babies switched over into fearful toddlers and children. So it looks like we can move inhibited, fearful babies out of that position with good environmental inputs. Now, it's really super important, though, to note that big variable component, because a lot of people think that if you were to adopt a baby, let's say at the age of 1, and then give them a really secure environment and really, a very supportive environment, that they're going to display healthy responses to that, that they'll develop, a non-fearful approach to the world because they've got such a secure environment raising them now. It turns out, and the textbook talks about what we learned from children who were adopted out of Romanian orphanages back in the 80s, that the closer the child is to a year old, the less impact the environment has on their basic temperament. So while I'm being encouraging, I'm assuming that the environment has been the same for these fearful babies, and that if you have a baby with a disposition towards fearfulness, but an environment that really encourages from birth, no, the world is safe. It's not going to harm you. You don't need to be fearful. For a lot of these babies, they move into at least variable, if not positive. But I just want to underscore that's in a consistent environment that's consistently giving them that kind of information. The first year of life is really super important, as the Romanian orphans show us. And so you can't take a baby out of a really bad situation when they're already 12, 13, 14 months old and expect to change their approach to the world. It's probably not going to happen. So emotions kind of develop in what we call a mutual regulation model. I've mentioned before in class that a lot of us who don't have children yet, and so all our knowledge of child rearing really comes from being reared. It feels like our parents were so influential and that they imposed stuff on us, that the way that they saw the world was what we were supposed to adopt, or the way that they acted was what we were supposed to do, or what we liked was supposed to be what they liked. What the research shows us is that parents respond to their infants way more than I think non-parents would expect. It's a mutual regulation model. If we look at the brain development in babies, at birth, we have, their prenatal dispositions in place, like what they came into the world already having. And then we have, the green arrows are representing, if everything's going great. So they're being fed properly, they get attention when they need attention, they get touch when they need touch, somebody is talking to them in a sort of interactive back and forth way, even before they know language, like everything's going correctly. The child's prenatal dispositions will interact with this, environmental influences to combine with those genetic influences to produce normal brain development in most babies. If you exceed optimal intervention and, let's say, start teaching your 6-month-old, a second language using flashcards, or try and teach them to count, or you try and do something that's, supra optimal, so above optimal intervention, it doesn't really have much impact on the developing brain. If you are a little suboptimal, so maybe there's not as much give and take as far as the talking as maybe would be ideal for baby's development, but there is talking and there is interaction with the baby, it's probably not going to have much impact on the baby's brain development. Like there's this wide range of what is considered optimal and fine. Where we get into trouble is in environmental influences where the baby's deprived of nutrition, or the baby is ignored, or doesn't ever get touched. These kinds of, rarely gets touched. These are the kinds of environmental influences that can start to have an impact on brain development. A lot of us focus on boosting brain development. Oh, what can I do to make my baby extra smart or extra, brainy? Not a lot. There's not a lot that you can do to really change their normal brain development. It's going to, given normal kinds of levels of interaction with the environment, the brain will develop as it's designed to do. So here we have a mom holding a baby. We're going to assume, I got it off the internet, so I don't know who these people are, but one of the big impacts of parent-child interaction is the development of synchrony. Typically, the mom reacts to the baby and then the baby reacts to the mom. That's the way typically synchrony flows. Adults imitate the baby's tone. Adults imitate the baby's, rhythm of activity and things like that. The parents tend to react much more to the baby than the baby does to the parent. And that starts when the baby's not that responsive to the environment and continues on even as the baby's starting to understand language and things like that. Because adults respond to these very subtle nuances of baby facial expressions, because parents respond to very subtle body motions and things like that, parents are reacting to the baby. As the baby ages, for one thing, in the last chapter, I talked about contingency awareness. The baby starts to realize, oh, I'm having an influence on my environment, and that gives them a sense of confidence and security. But it also builds this synchrony between the parent and the child, where the parent is in tune with their child and realizes the child's needs and maybe can anticipate some of the child's needs, so that the child can really have fewer moments of extreme frustration or moments of extreme hunger, or these kinds of extremes that are potentially things that could be harmful for developing babies. Synchrony is much more common in parent-child relationships, where the parent is allowed to have this kind of unfettered access to their baby, and can really develop routines and things around their baby's needs, stuff like that. So we see it a lot in Asian cultures, and less commonly in Western cultures. A lot of times moms in Western cultures don't get the privilege of getting to be with their babies all day and have this kind of interaction, or the choice to be with their babies all the time. Some moms don't want to be enmeshed in child rearing from 6 weeks on. They're like, oh, I don't want to be with them all day. I want to have adult contact, and I want to have these other things. And so they may not be in as much synchrony with their baby as a mom who is embedded in that context, and having this unfettered access to their baby as the baby's experiencing all these different things. Some people are better at developing synchrony with their babies than other people. So it's not sex-based. It turns out that, no, it is sex-based. Sorry, it is sex-based. On average, women are better at developing synchrony with infants than on average men are. That is not to say that men can't, and that all women can. It is to say that on average, probably due to evolutionary influences, because the females of the species have done the child rearing for millennia, they have better facial expression recognition. Women today are much better at recognizing what a facial expression means than men are. They are much better at interpreting body language. And so that helps to facilitate synchrony. So it makes it a little bit more likely that a female will be in tune or in synchrony with their baby than a male will be. But it's not a guarantee. You have to work at it, you have to be paying attention, and you have to have access in order to get into that kind of synchrony with your baby. Now, babies also, right, it's a mutual regulation model, and so babies are looking to their parent or caregiver for information about how they should be reacting in a particular situation. And so we talked about this in the last chapter, the idea that if you're in an unusual situation, or a new person has arrived, or something like that, babies will look to their caregiver for, is this something I should be laughing at, or is this something I should be scared of? Is this something I should be approaching, or something that I should be retreating from? And we call that social referencing. So it's a mutual regulation model where babies are learning to manage their emotions, in part by cueing off of what the adult is indicating in this particular situation. Now, there are some sex differences in how we label babies' emotions. When baby girls cry, they are more likely to be attributed to crying because they're scared, because something scared them. Oh, the noise was too loud, that scared them. Boy babies are more likely to have their emotions labeled as anger reactions. So a baby boy's cries are because he's angry. A baby girl's cries are because she's scared. We start that kind of labeling really early, and so the baby ultimately can internalize as a child that, oh, I'm a boy. When I'm feeling an emotion, the one I feel comfortable with is anger. And when a girl has an emotion, the one she feels comfortable with is fear. Like, that's the one that's been labeled and supported throughout their life so far. And so that's what they're going to feel more comfortable expressing. And so from very early on, early in infancy, we will see adults labeling children's cries, babies' cries, as a function of their sex rather than a function of whatever triggered the actual cry. All right, I'm going to stop on emotion. We'll come back in the next segment and we'll talk about the strange situation and attachment development.